So in the scheme of things, let's just say many of us got told, you're weird, you're bad, you're crazy, you deserved it, it's your fault. Now you get those messages in a variety of contexts, in a variety of ways, in a variety of relationships for a long time. At the same time, you're trying to shape fitting in to the world. You learn how to do the dance. You learn how to have these beliefs about yourself at the same time you're trying to act in a way that fits in so you don't keep getting in trouble. Does that make sense? So you're walking around with this kind of bizarre way of being in the world that can't help but kind of build on itself in not such a healthy way. So we learn to do this dance, and we're walking around thinking all these things about ourselves, believing all these beliefs, and at the same time we're meeting people who say things to us like, wow, you're really cool, I like you a lot. And inside we're going, what are you, nuts? You don't know anything about me. I'm crazy, I'm bad, I deserved it, I deserve the worst in life. So this bind really kind of builds up, and we get into this thing of cutting people off, cutting the relationship off, even before it gets started in lots of ways, because we can't share our whole story for whatever reasons. We've learned to act as if. For me, this story really hit home. Probably many of you have heard me tell this story, but it's one of my favorite stories. When I was in social work school a number of years ago, I was kind of a student by day and a chronic mental patient by night, and by weekend. And it was pretty disturbing because I was being helped by many of my classmates, and who had to keep it a secret because of confidentiality, and needless to say, I didn't particularly want it being shared. It was a wild time. And then I'd go to class and talk and, share my ideas and so forth, and feel pretty competent until I got out again, where this secrecy thing kind of built up in my head again, and I felt like, you don't know what you're talking about. These people are real people. You're nuts. You're in hospitals on the weekend, for God's sake. What are you doing in social work school? And I started to feel like I was carrying a double life. It was like, Batman and whoever he is on the other. Who's Batman when he's not Batman? There you go. Only I didn't have a Batman kind of mentality about it. So one Thanksgiving I was in a hospital, and for the second time I was being threatened with losing custody of my children simply by being in a hospital. And a colleague now of mine, who was then a nurse, knew me pretty well, and she knew I was struggling with school and so forth, and she kind of picked me up by the scruff of the neck and said, Sherry, are you going to be a social worker or are you going to be a chronic mental patient? You have 10 minutes to decide. Literally, that's what she said. And frankly, up to that point, I did not know I had a choice. I did not know that it was possible to not live in this way. So that kind of pressure, that kind of dance that we do in the world, builds on itself. We have all this internal process, however it manifests itself, that is being labeled in certain ways crazy, so you don't talk about it, so you don't make new meaning of it, so it just builds on itself. And then pretty soon you start to say, what's my problem? And you seek help. Okay, so here you are. You've now felt pretty crazy, and you go to seek help for your problem. The first thing that happens generally in the traditional system when you go for help is that you're assessed for a diagnosis. Is that true for many people? So I find that really an interesting first contact conversation. And I absolutely believe that first contact conversations drive. You can't get out of it. Once you started on one of those conversations, it's a no-win situation. You're there. You're stuck. So the first conversation is, I've come in for help with my problem, and you've now diagnosed it. Great! Now I understand. Have you ever heard people go, it was so great to hear I had X diagnosis or X. I finally made sense of all my problems. And it's a real easy, it's almost seductive in some ways to get into. Now, treatment gets defined by my symptoms. And I got really good at living up to the criteria of the diagnosis of the week, you know. What are the criteria? I could do that. If it's schizophrenia, I can do that. And pretty soon, I start seeing my life, my feelings, my experiences, the way I make sense out of things, the way I relate. I start defining those as symptoms and as part of my problem. Now that's pretty scary. So now that I've gotten into this conversation and defined myself by this diagnosis, and my conversations with treatment or help are about managing my symptoms, I'm kind of a walking bag of symptoms. And the best we can do is to manage our symptoms. How are you managing your symptoms is a bizarre question to ask. You don't hear that kind of question in the community. Do you go to your hairdresser and she says to you, how are you managing your symptoms? I mean, think about it. But it's become part of our culture. We talk about things in those ways. So then, anyway, this pressure has built. I start to feel really intense kinds of feelings. You've labeled it on the other end, not you personally, but you in the treatment reality have labeled that feeling as out of control. Call me when you're feeling in crisis. Call me when you're out of control. So I say, I'm out of control. And the response is, up your medication, should you be hospitalized, you know, safety contracts, the whole 9 yards. It all boils down to liability. So you're a walking bag of symptoms, managing them, always risking that out of controlness. When is that crisis going to come? As if it were a planned kind of thing. I remember early on in a peer support program that I ran, this really hit home for me when a friend of mine said, well, every August I go in the hospital and have shock treatments. She planned, I mean, she made a date with the hospital. I mean, insurance companies probably don't do that now, but she literally had this plan because it was so in her mind and in her thinking that she was going to go into this psychiatric crisis and need shock treatments. That's what she sort of planned on, been told, et cetera, et cetera. Because she had come to see all of her big feelings, if you will, as symptoms. So, you know, I thought we could do something different. And I think we have begun to do something different. Because we're not a treatment kind of organization or establishment or relationship. However, I started to see some flaws in our thinking as I was sort of doing more and more peer support. So now let's say somebody comes to you or somebody comes into a peer support program for some peer support. And good news is we're not assessing and evaluating each other. Good news, right? We get to know each other. Our whole lives are, you know, we share stories, we probably share diagnoses, and, you know, that's the language we've learned, et cetera, et cetera. We feel pretty good. Until one of us acts weird, or is having a difficult time, or scares me. And then all of a sudden, we get in this assessment mode. And once again, we're going, Tanya, Steve's been acting kind of weird lately. Do you think we should call his case manager? These were the kinds of things I was beginning to hear pretty consistently when anybody was uncomfortable. And that really concerned me. Because so long as everybody was good in managing their symptoms, it was fine. But when things got elevated, we began to act just like what was done to us. And that really shook me up because I didn't see that as helpful, and I didn't see that as the way we wanted to proceed. And at that time, I was working on the development of an alternative crisis, peer-run crisis program, and I was really clear that that's not the way we would want to respond. In any case, when this dance started and somebody says, well, what if I say the wrong thing? And then they just... And so we ask each other these questions. Are you safe? Will you be safe? Will you sign a safety contract? All these liability kinds of questions, which gets us back into the power dynamic and the medical analysis that we're trying to shift. And pretty soon, we have the establishment of these peer relationships that are no longer equal. We have staff and members. We have workers and clients. We have the same old, same old. And we're not helping each other. We're making assumptions about who's sick and who's not. We had to really take a hard look at this power dynamic and begin to think, what are the kinds of things that bring us back into a different conversation? So this time, in peer support, somebody comes to you for help, whatever that means. Same process. You listen to each other, you get to know each other, you learn a lot about each other. You become friends. Then, when one of the people in the friendship has a hard time, you struggle with the fear around that together. You say to each other things like, you know, when you're pounding your fist against the wall, it scares me half out of my mind. I can sit with you, but it's too hard for me to sit with you when you're going to break your fist. These are the conversations we can have with each other. So we struggle with that fear together instead of assessing each other and evaluating each other. We leave the responsibility for help in the relationship instead of an outside expert. So in those struggles, we negotiate. We talk about power. We talk about conflict and safety. We talk about what makes for a safe relationship. We talk about what's going to work for both of us to stay in the dialogue, to stay in relationship, because we're invested. And I have this theory. You may or may not agree with me, and that's okay. If there is such a thing, and I'm saying this loosely, as mental illness, I believe that it's all about disconnect. I don't believe you can be out of reality, for lack of better language, and be connected. So I want us to think about the connection between people, that negotiation, that power struggle, that depth building as the core element that we're working with.